Well, you know, one of my favorite Jewish holiday is Purim. And that's the holiday that's described in this book of Esther. And most people outside of Judaism really don't understand Purim because it's a very odd and weird holiday. You could call it an unholy holy day because it tries to offend much of our religious sensibilities. And that might be the reason why you might not be familiar with Purim, because many Christian pastors want to shield you from the offensive element of this holiday. But let me give you some background information on Esther, or on Purim. When the book of Esther is read in synagogue, most of you, or most of the attendees, they dress up as a favorite character from the book. You could come as a beautiful queen, Esther, or you could Vashti, or you could come as the venerable Mordecai, or you could come as the king, or you could come as the evil Haman if you're really feeling mischievous. And if you really want to get into the spirit of Purim, you could even cross-dress. Men could be women. It's kind of like a Jewish version of Halloween, but it's sanctioned by the rabbis. Moreover, you don't just read it. You really get worked up. I was going to ask you to do this, but it might have been too shocking to do it while I'm reading it. But whenever the name of Haman is read, you're supposed to go, boo! Ah! Right? Go look up YouTube Purim service. You'll see. And, you know, whenever Esther or Mordecai is read, it's just a very fun day. Right? It doesn't stop there. The people during Purim are encouraged to drink, not just a glass or two, but so much so that you're supposed to drink so much so that you can't distinguish between the evil Haman and the blessed Mordecai that much. Why they do that? Because if you read Esther, there's a lot of drinking. If you watch Israeli TV, reporters will go to a section of Jerusalem called Mea Sharim. And that's a very ultra-Orthodox or ultra-religious neighborhood. And they would show everybody, just people walking like this, they're drunk, right? And the funniest thing is, little teen boy, maybe about Evan's age, don't do this, this is from another guy. He's drinking, he's drunk, he's staggering, and he starts chain smoking with his parents looking out laughing. And the rabbis just love it. Moreover, I mean, that's a shocking part. Right? Moreover, Purim seems very secular because the book of Esther does not mention the name of God at all. In fact, doesn't have any religious activities in it. And the thing that really goes over, it just bothers people when they read it, is that a perfectly nice Jewish girl marries a goy, and nobody bats an eye. They don't practice kashrut. So it's been debated, all these elements, due to that, it's been debated for centuries. Does the book of Esther belong in the Bible? So you have to ask the question, why does the book of Esther and Purim try to really offend the sacred Jewish religious conventions and sensibilities? The reason is very simple. The book of Esther is a brilliant satire. It was the Saturday Night Live of its day. If you read it that way, it makes perfect sense. It challenges the ancient Israelites' most sacred traditions and values, not because the authors had some axe to grind, but because they saw that their society needed careful introspection into their values and assumptions. You see, the ancient Israelites, they were conquered by the Babylonians, were exiled to Babylonia in 587 BCE. But to their utter surprise, The seemingly invincible Babylonians fell to the Persians in 539 BC. Within a very relative short time, like 60 years, they saw that their own nations fall, their temple destroyed, and the demise of the mighty Babylonian Empire. All these things made them question, especially their conventions, assumptions they used to hold sacred in Jerusalem. See, when you read it, the main characters are named Mordecai and Esther. Basically, they're a derivative of foreign gods named Marduk and Ishtar. The author of this book was writing with a sledgehammer, was making a point. It would be like a fundamental Baptist preacher saying, I'm going to name my twin sons Moshe and Muhammad. People would be like, whoa, what are you doing that for? They were making a point. It was calling for our attention. It's fascinating. Why does this book made it to the Bible? And more amazing is that even though it's offensive, looking at one eyes, on another view, it is very modern. It is very relevant to the world that we live here today, even though it was written 2,300 years ago. For example, the book tackles racism and bigotry. It highlights the cruel violence that these negative aspects of human nature incites in us. Haman is not only hates somebody from another race, he wants to commit genocide because of his hatred for one person. The book is brilliant in the way it shows how ugly and petty racism can be. Another example of how this book is far ahead of its time is that it criticizes abuses in authority. And it does it through mainly the king. And the portrayal of this king is not really historical. You could call it an aggregate of all the foreign kings they saw. And the same quality you find in this king is found in book of Daniel, in King Nebuchadnezzar, and all these foreign kings. Because when the Jews lived in Israel, or Jerusalem, their leaders were sanctioned by their God. They couldn't really criticize. But when they were in exile, they could look at their rulers with clear and lucid eyes. And this is what they saw. The kings and rulers, these foreign rulers, were very temperamental. They were subject to manipulation by the court and very superficial. This is what Professor Michael V. Fox notes in his commentary of Esther. He says, the king, this Persian king, is all surface. Other characters have their private thoughts. Haman schemes, broods, fantasizes about his own glorification, but it's hard to imagine the king having any thoughts not obvious to anyone. His character consists of a few obvious moods and impulses. Indeed, his most dangerous flaw is his failure to think. And I might add, in the New Testament gospel writers pick up on this. And the thing that this king says, even the half of my kingdom, the gospel writers attribute to one of King Herod, king's son, to somebody who had this kind of character. It's a signal to everyone reading, this king is foolish. Another article I read was Purim, the celebration of disorder. And the author points out that you see all these reversals in this book and in Purim, like cross-dressing or pretending to be a Gentile, doing things just way crazy, right? What that was pointing to the fact that the Jews in exile lived in a topsy-turvy world, an upside-down kingdom. He points out there's a lot of drinking in Esther because when you're drunk, your values disappear. You do crazy stuff. And that's how it feels like when you live in exile. And their coping mechanism was to retell their story in a comic fashion, in a satire. And the author goes to say, the comic frame enables people to be observers of themselves while acting, and the ultimate end would not be becoming passive, but achieving ultimate consciousness. One would transcend himself by noting one's faults. See, when you're acting out, when you're being comedy, when you're laughing at it yourself, you're saying, these are the things that are fault with me. I think also the Israelites in exile found themselves in a pluralistic environment, polytheistic, multilingual, basically strange world where they could not understand. And they were given a chance to look at themselves, and they begin to see, these are the things that are wrong with us. They were no longer the majority, the center, the main perspective. They were no longer the ethnic group, but they were one of many competing ethnic groups. They were not the center of the universe. It's like, I know I'm just stretching, but in the Scarlet Letter, right? You know, all the people are written. Scarlet Letter. Hester Prynne, when she wears the letter A, and when she's exiled, it says, Nathaniel Hawthorne says, she began to see her community in a very different light. Now, I'm going to go to the front, and there's one thing that really it tackles, and I want to mention that, and it goes to the beginning of Esther, and this is about Queen Vashti, who was outed, who was deposed, and then Queen Esther came, but it describes, chapter 1 describes the circumstances. And it begins with the king holding a lavish party for the leaders who are serving under him. He brags about his kingdom for 180 days. After he does that, he says, I'm going to have a party. So he has a drinking fest for 7 days. At the middle of the last day, he says, and at that time it was customary to have parties separately, male. It just custom a long time ago, because they were modesty, right? So he gets drunk. He says he was married. He was in a state of marriage. He says to his servants, go get my Queen Vashti and tell her to come to this party to show her beauty. To show her beauty. You could interpret it in any way you want. But for her, on multiple levels, it was an insult. It was humiliating. So she refuses. And the king gets really upset. And he goes to his court sage advisors and says, what should I do? What should I do? Like, this queen does not obey me. And they said this. They said, for this deed of the queen will be made known to all women, causing them to look with contempt on their husbands. Since they will say, the king commanded the queen to be brought before him, and she did not come. So, all these male court advisors recommended the king to dispose his queen, the one who stood up for her rights and dignity. And it ends, the first chapter ends, says, they wrote this decree, they wrote this law, saying the Queen Vashti had to be disposed because she was not obedient to the king. And it ends with this line, declaring that every man should be the master in his own house. It was a satire about male chauvinism. And that's what it tackles. If you read this book before and didn't catch the humor in this, I invite you to read it again tonight. This book that places the most vulnerable and powerless person in society, Esther, who is an orphan girl, who was forcibly displaced from her country, sold as a slave. This story tells a triumphant victory and rise of this girl. It's an extraordinary book for such time as this. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.